Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On August 24, 2017, at 6:15 in the morning, truck driver Samuel Daniels stopped at a Chevron gas station in the small town of Lee Vining, California. He hadn't turned off the engine yet when he saw a figure emerging from the thick fog from the forest. It looked like a scene from a horror movie. The man was so emaciated that his skin was literally covering his skull. He was wearing rags that had once been clothes, and his legs were wrapped in pieces of tarpaulin. He moved mechanically, like a broken doll. The man went into the store, took a bottle of water from the shelf, but could not open it. His fingers did not obey. He just sat down on the floor near the refrigerators and froze, staring at one point. When the sheriff's deputy arrived, the unknown man did not say a word. His fingerprints were run through the database, and the result made the officer on duty turn pale. It was Melvin Griffin, a man who had been officially dead for 760 days. But the worst thing was not his return, but what he was hiding about the fate of his wife and daughter, who disappeared with him. On July 12, 2015, at exactly 11:42 in the morning, a video surveillance camera at the Tioga Pass checkpoint recorded the entry of a dark blue Chevy Silverado pickup truck with California license plates. The sun was at its zenith, casting a blinding light on the hot asphalt, making the image on the recording look slightly overexposed. The car was driven by 45-year-old architect Melvin Griffin. In the passenger seat, hiding her face behind wide sunglasses, was his wife, Pearl. In the back seat, one could see the silhouette of their 16-year-old daughter, Louise. This was the last time the family was seen on video. They were driving into the eastern part of Yosemite Park, leaving civilization behind. And none of the checkpoint attendants could have guessed that this ordinary weekend would be the beginning of one of the most confusing cases in the county's history. The route the Griffins chose was not a simple walk. They were planning a 3-day hike from Alpine Saddleback Lake to Lundy Canyon. This is a wild, rugged area where granite cliffs give way to alpine meadows, and the weather can change in a matter of minutes. Ranger Thomas Anderson, who was on duty at the Tuolumne Meadows Permit Center that day, remembered the family well. Later, during interrogations, he would tell investigators that the atmosphere between the three was so tense that it was physically palpable. Melvin Griffin filled out the permit paperwork with trembling hands, constantly wiping sweat from his forehead, even though the room was air-conditioned. He was confused about the dates and asked several times about the weather forecast. According to the ranger, Pearl Griffin was standing by the door, arms crossed over her chest, looking like she had just been crying. But it was his daughter's behavior that struck Anderson the most. 16-year-old Louisa stood at a distance from her parents, defiantly looking at a map on the wall. She did not say a word to her mother or father. When Melvin called her over to sign the safety manual, she approached slowly, with a look of deep disgust on her face, silently signed it, and then walked away in silence. The ranger noted in the log that the group was prepared for the hike, had the necessary equipment and water, but in the notes column, he put a question mark next to the item about the psychological state of the group. On July 16, 2015, the day the Griffins were supposed to return to civilization, their phones were silent. Relatives began to worry in the evening of the same day, when neither Melvin nor Pearl got in touch to confirm their return. On July 17th, at 8:30 in the morning, Pearl's sister filed a missing persons report with the police. The response was immediate, as it was a family with a minor child in a difficult mountainous area. At 12 o'clock in the afternoon, a patrol found the Griffin's pickup truck parked near the Saddlebag Lake Dam. The vehicle was covered with a layer of dust, indicating that it had been parked there for several days. The doors were locked. An inspection of the interior through the glass showed perfect order, which was atypical of tourists who usually leave their cars in disarray before setting out on a route. When the officers were given permission to open the car, they found the couple's wallets with cash and credit cards under the front seat, as well as their cell phones turned off. It was standard practice for experienced hackers not to take extra valuables and electronics to places without cellular coverage. However, one detail in the back seat made investigators freeze. On the dark gray upholstery was a white paper package from a pharmacy. These were powerful neuroleptics prescribed to Louise Griffin just 2 days before the trip. The package was completely intact, the film was not torn, and not a single pill was missing. According to the medical records that the police received later, the girl needed to take this medication daily to control aggression and stabilize her mood. A sudden withdrawal of the drug could have led to unpredictable consequences, including acute psychosis. The fact that the vital medication remained in the car meant one of two things. Either it was a fatal mistake, or someone had deliberately decided that they would no longer be needed. On July 18th, a large-scale search and rescue operation began. 2 National Guard helicopters equipped with thermal imagers took to the skies. The search area covered the 20 Lakes Basin, a complex system of glacial reservoirs surrounded by sharp cliffs. 50 professional rescuers and volunteers were working on the ground. They combed every yard of the rocky desert, looking under every boulder and into every crevice. Dog handlers brought specially trained dogs that were allowed to sniff the clothes of the missing people from the car. The dogs confidently picked up the trail from the parking lot. They led the search team along the lakeshore, then up a rocky path toward the Lundy Pass. The trail was clear for 3 miles, but at the foot of a large scree, where the trail became barely visible among the piles of rocks, the dogs suddenly stopped. They circled in place, whining and refusing to go any further, as if the scent had simply disappeared. The weather conditions that year were abnormal. Even in July, there were large snowfields on the northern slopes that melted slowly, turning mountain streams into raging torrents of icy water. The police put forward the main version. The Griffin family, trying to get around the snow blockage, went off the marked trail. Probably one of them slipped on wet stones or ice and fell into the abyss, dragging the others with him. Or they got lost and died of hypothermia when the temperature dropped below 0 at night. The search lasted 14 days. The rescuers checked all known and unknown routes within a 10-mile radius of the place where the dogs lost their trail. They examined abandoned gold rush mines, caves, and gorges. Not a single trace. Not a single scrap of clothing, not a single energy bar wrapper, not a single trace of a campfire. The Griffin family seemed to have vanished into the thin mountain air of the Sierra Nevada. On July 31, 2015, a spokesperson for the Mono County Sheriff's Office issued a statement to the press. He said that the active phase of the search had been suspended due to the lack of new leads and the exhaustion of resources. The case was reclassified as a missing persons case, and the probable cause of the disappearance was an accident in a remote area. The Griffins' case files were put on the archive shelf. The family was left alone with their grief and uncertainty. But one of the detectives who examined the car on the first day couldn't get one detail out of his mind. He kept coming back to that unopened package of pills in the back seat. It seemed to him an ominous sign, a silent witness to a tragedy that had begun long before the Griffins set foot on the mountain trail. This white box screamed that the incident in the mountains was no accident. And although the mountains were silent, the detective felt that this silence was temporary. Somewhere there, among the granite and ice, was an answer, and it was more terrifying than any fall from a cliff. On August 24, 2017, at 6:15 in the morning, truck driver Samuel Daniels pulled his 18-wheeler to a stop at a Chevron gas station in the tiny town of Lee Vining, California. The place served as the eastern gateway to Yosemite, and usually at this early hour it was quiet, broken only by the hum of refrigerators and the occasional car on Highway 395. Daniels hadn't even turned off the engine when movement at the edge of the wooded area that came close to the asphalt lot caught his attention. Out of the thick morning fog stepped a figure that looked more like a character from a nightmare than a living person. The man was so emaciated that his skin, burnt dark brown by the highland sun, seemed to be stretched directly over the bones of his skull. He was wearing dirty rags that had once been expensive hiking clothes, and his feet were wrapped in pieces of tarpaulin and secured with rusty wire instead of shoes. He moved slowly, mechanically, swaying in the wind, like a broken puppet being pulled by invisible strings. The truck driver would later tell the police that his first thought was to lock the cab door, but something in the stranger's eyes made him freeze. The man walked past the fuel pumps, ignoring the people, and entered the gas station store. The bell above the door jangled, but the visitor didn't even flinch. He went to the refrigerator with drinks, took a liter bottle of water with trembling hands, but couldn't unscrew it. His fingers were too weak and crippled. He just sank down on the cold tiled floor, clutched the bottle to his chest, and stood there looking at a single point on the wall. When a sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later, the unknown man did not say a word. He did not resist, but he also did not respond to commands. The officer, noticing the man's condition, called an ambulance, and while the paramedics were on their way, scanned the detainee's fingerprints through a mobile identification terminal. When the result appeared on the device's screen, the sheriff's deputy felt a chill run down his spine. The system identified the man as Melvin Griffin, a man who had been officially presumed dead for 760 days. But the most frightening thing was not his return, but the dead silence he brought with him from the forest. On the same day, at 14 hours and 30 minutes, 15 miles from the gas station in Lee Vining, another part of this tragedy unfolded. A group of 3 local fishermen were heading up Mill Creek in a remote part of Lundy Canyon. This is a wild area where steep cliffs squeeze the riverbed and waterfalls roaring down from a height, creating dangerous whirlpools. The fishermen were looking for new places to catch trout, moving away from the tourist trails. One of the men noticed a strange object wedged between 2 massive granite boulders in the middle of a raging stream. At first, it looked like a pile of trash brought by a spring flood, but the bright orange color of the synthetic fabric stood out unnaturally against the gray rocks and dark water. The fishermen decided to check the find. After spending almost 40 minutes walking across slippery stones to the middle of the stream, they realized that it was an old tourist backpack that water and time had turned into a half-rotten rag. The straps were firmly caught on underwater snags, and the men had to cut them with a knife to pull the item ashore. When the backpack was on the grass, a black plastic bag, tightly wrapped with electrical tape, fell out of its torn main compartment. It was unnaturally heavy. One of the fishermen, driven by curiosity, carefully cut the plastic. What they saw inside made them instantly recoil and call the rangers. Inside the sealed package, among the wet paper and silt, were human remains, fragments of a tibia and a human skull. A Mono County investigative team led by Detective Mark Harrison immediately arrived at the scene. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape. Forensic investigators worked until late afternoon, recording every detail. The backpack was identified by the remnants of a manufacturing tag and specific hardware. It was the exact model that Pearl Griffin had purchased at a sports store in San Francisco a week before her fatal trip. The fact that the remains were wrapped in plastic and hidden in a backpack indicated that this was not an accidental movement of the body by water. Someone was trying to hide or transport them. An emergency DNA test conducted in a Sacramento laboratory gave results 48 hours later. The remains belonged to Pearl Griffin, the wife of Melvin, who was now in a hospital room under guard. But the real shock for the investigators was the report of the forensic anthropologist that followed the identification. The expert found a clear, depressed fracture, about 5 centimeters in diameter, on the back of the skull. The nature of the radio cracks indicated a blunt force trauma. But the most important thing was that the edges of the fracture showed no signs of healing, and the spongy substance of the bone was free of river water and microorganisms typical of drowning. This meant that Pearl Griffin's heart had stopped before her body was even in the water. She had not been washed away by the current, and she had not fallen from the cliff into the water. The conclusion was unequivocal. Her death was caused by a head injury inflicted by an unauthorized person. The case of the disappearance, which had been considered a tragic accident for 2 years, was immediately reclassified. Now, it was an investigation into a murder with particular cruelty. And the only witness who could tell what had happened in the mountains was silent, staring at the wall with blank eyes while detectives prepared a warrant for his arrest as the main suspect. Friends, before we continue to dive into this confusing and gruesome case, I have an important request for you. YouTube's algorithms work in such a way that without your activity, this video will simply get lost among thousands of others. If you are interested in learning the truth about the Griffin family, please subscribe to the channel, click like, and leave any comment below this video. It will only take you a few seconds, but it will help to promote the story so that as many people as possible can see it. Thank you for your support. And now, let's get back to the investigation. On August 25, 2017, Melvin Griffin was held in an isolated box at Mono General Hospital under round-the-clock police protection. His physical condition, despite extreme exhaustion and dehydration, slowly stabilized thanks to IV fluids and the efforts of doctors. However, his mind remained locked in a dark room, the keys to which were lost somewhere in the Sierra Nevada mountains. After a series of examinations, the clinic's leading psychiatrist, Dr. Elizabeth Wong, made a preliminary diagnosis of dissociative fugue complicated by severe post-traumatic stress disorder. It was a defense mechanism of the psyche, which refused to accept reality in order not to collapse completely. Melvin was conscious. He ate on his own if a spoon was put in his hand, and he fulfilled simple requests from the nurses, such as, "Raise your hand," or "Open your mouth." But he did not speak. Not a single word. He sat on the hospital bed for hours, staring at the white wall opposite, and his gaze was so empty that the nurses tried not to enter the room unless they had to. The silence surrounding the man was thicker than the fog in the mountains. Mono County detectives working the Pearl Griffin murder case had no time to wait for therapeutic progress. They had the corpse of a woman with a fractured skull and a man who emerged from the woods alive 2 years after her death. The scenario seemed obvious. On August 26, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Detective Mark Harrison entered the room to conduct the first official interrogation. He turned on the recorder, announced the date and time, and then sat down across from Melvin. "Melvin, we know about Pearl," the detective said, placing a photo of the backpack found in the creek on the table. "We know she was murdered. The medical examiner proved it wasn't an accident. Did you hit her? Did you leave her there to die?" Melvin didn't even blink. His heart rate on the monitor remained steady at 65 beats per minute. "If you're not talking to protect yourself, it won't work," Harrison continued, raising his voice. "But there's someone else." "Where is Louise? Where's your daughter, Melvin? Did you kill her too?" The second the name Louise was uttered, the life support equipment blasted out an alarming beep. Melvin's heart rate instantly jumped to 140 beats. His body arched and his hands began to shake so violently that the metal bed rails rattled. He closed his eyes and began to gasp for air, but made no sound. This was not the reaction of a grieving father. It was animal, panicked terror. The doctors were forced to interrupt the interrogation and administer sedatives to the patient. For the police, this reaction was another proof of guilt. The investigation built a clear, logical version: domestic violence that ended in tragedy. The psychological portrait of Melvin was painted as a tyrant who took the family to the mountains to kill his wife without witnesses. Louise probably became an accidental witness to her mother's murder, and her father got rid of her in the same way as his wife. This theory explained everything: the hidden bodies, Melvin's escape, and his silence. The district attorney was already preparing documents to file charges of double murder. However, to close the case, they needed to find a motive or a history of conflict. Detectives pulled up old archives from 2015, which were collected during the first investigation of the disappearance. At that time, the San Francisco police interviewed neighbors and colleagues, but did not delve into Louise's school records, as the family was considered to be well off and the disappearance was considered an accident. On August 27th, a young assistant investigator, sorting through dusty boxes of documents, came across a folder from the school where Louisa had studied. Inside was a report from the school psychologist, dated March 2015, 4 months before the trip. The document was marked confidential, but its contents turned the whole idea of the Griffin family upside down. The psychologist wrote that she had called her parents to the school because of Louise's disturbing behavior. The girl was intellectually developed, but she demonstrated a complete lack of empathy and a tendency to manipulate. But the most important thing was the paragraph that the police had ignored 2 years ago. The psychologist noted, "During the joint session, I observed an atypical dynamic. The parents are afraid of their child. There is deep emotional violence in this family, but its vector is not from adults to the child, but vice versa. Louise terrorizes her parents with suicide threats and false accusations. The mother, Pearl Griffin, confided in me privately that she locks her bedroom door at night because she is afraid her daughter might come in." This report, along with the full package of neuroleptics found in the car that the girl had stopped taking before the hike, made the detectives stop. They suddenly realized that Melvin's trembling at the mention of his daughter's name might not have been caused by shame for the murder, but by an overwhelming fear of someone who might still be wandering somewhere in the woods. And if Melvin kept silent not to save himself, but because he knew something much worse, then the police were looking for the wrong monster. On September 1st, 2017, exactly 1 week after the exhausted Melvin Griffin came out to the people, a group of professional climbers was climbing the northern slope of Mount Conness. This is a remote and harsh section of the park, located at an altitude of over 3,000 meters above sea level, where the air is thin and the snow does not melt even in the height of summer. Around 2 in the afternoon, while looking for protection from a sudden squally wind, the climbers noticed a narrow gap between 2 granite slabs that was unnaturally filled with small stones. After dismantling the blockage, they found themselves in a small cave that looked more like the hole of a trapped animal than a tourist campsite. Inside, it smelled of mold, old ash, and fear. There was a pile of dry moss on the floor that served as a bed, and gnawed bones of rodents and birds were scattered around. It was a place where people did not live, but survived, hiding from the whole world. But the most interesting discovery was found in the far corner of the cave, in a deep niche covered with a flat stone. There was a plastic food container tightly wrapped with several layers of silver-reinforced tape for complete tightness. When the climbers handed over the find to the rangers, who in turn handed it over to Mono County detectives, the container was opened in a sterile laboratory. Inside, wrapped in a dirty t-shirt, was a third-generation GoPro digital action camera. Its body was scratched, but the memory card remained intact, preserved as a precious treasure. It took technical experts several hours to recover the data. Most of the files were damaged by time and moisture, but the last video stored on the card survived. Its metadata indicated the date, July 14, 2015. Time of shooting, 18 hours and 30 minutes. It was the evening of the second day of the Griffin's hike, less than 48 hours before they disappeared. Detective Harrison and the district attorney gathered around the monitor to watch the recording. The video began with a shaky start, with the camera apparently strapped to the chest of the cameraman, who, judging by the angle and voiceover, was Melvin. The image stabilized when the man sat down on the grass. The lens offered an incredible view of the sunset over the mountain range, but the atmosphere in the frame was so tense that it blocked the beauty of the landscape. Pearl appeared in the frame. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes, but tried to smile. She took out a foil-wrapped sandwich from her backpack and carefully, as if she were reaching out to a wild animal, held it out to the side where the third person was sitting. The camera turned and Louisa came into view. The 16-year-old girl was sitting on a boulder with her legs tucked under her. Her gaze was directed directly at the camera, and there was nothing human about it. It was a look of absolute, icy emptiness. When her mother's hand approached her with food, Louise did not take the sandwich. With a sharp, lightning-like movement, she struck Pearl's hand. The food flew into the dirt. The sound of the blow was clear and loud against the silence of nature. "Louise, that's enough!" Melvin's voice sounded off-screen. "We came here to get better, not to fight. Please, just eat." Louise's reaction to these words made the detectives in the viewing room look at each other. She didn't scream, didn't throw a tantrum, as normal teenagers do. She spoke quietly, with an eerie adult tone, slowly minting each word. "Get treatment?" she asked, tilting her head to the side. "Don't you think I know that?" Pearl tried to say something, reaching out to her daughter, but Louise stood up abruptly, looming over her mother, who instinctively recoiled. "I know these pills are to turn me into a vegetable," she hissed, looking directly into the lens as if she could see her father's soul through it. "So you can fuck and pretend you have a perfect family. But I won't drink it. I threw them away. Do you hear me, Dad? I threw it all away." The recording showed Pearl's hands shaking as she covered her face with her palms. Melvin was breathing heavily behind the camera. "Honey, we love you. We just want to help," he began, but Louise interrupted him with a laugh. "You're afraid of me," she said with a cold smile. "And rightly so. There are no doctors here, Dad. There are no locks on the bedroom door. It's just us." She took a step toward the camera, and the image shook as Melvin began to back away. "Turn it off," Louise ordered. "Turn the camera off or I'll smash it over your head." The last seconds of the video showed chaotic movement, the sound of a struggle, and a sharp impact, after which the recording stopped. The screen went black, but the echo of her voice could still be heard in the silence of the investigator's office. This short digital file turned the entire investigation around. It provided visual confirmation of what the police had suspected after finding the school records. This was not a video of a family vacation. It was documentation of a hostage situation. The power dynamics in the Griffin family were completely inverted. Two adults were held captive by their own child in the middle of a deserted desert. Detective Harrison rewound the video and paused it at the moment when Louise was talking about the lack of locks on the door. He zoomed in on her face. There was more than just teenage rebellion in her eyes. There was calculation. She already knew what was going to happen on July 14th. And the fact that Melvin had kept the camera, hiding it in an airtight container in his hole, showed one thing. He knew it was the only proof of his innocence. But he also knew that if this video was seen, his daughter would never be released. Investigators realized that the pills found in the car had not been forgotten. They had been discarded. The barrier had fallen. And now the police knew exactly who they were dealing with. Not with a frightened girl who got lost in the woods, but with a predator who deliberately cut off the escape routes for his victims. But the main question remained. If Melvin was able to escape and hide this evidence, where is Louise now, and why did she let him leave? Or was she just not done with her hunt yet? On September 3, 2017, the atmosphere in the interrogation room at Mono County Hospital was so thick that the air felt heavy. Detective Mark Harrison entered the room at 9 o'clock sharp in the morning. He didn't carry any files with him, didn't turn on his recorder defiantly, and didn't start by reading the rights. He had only one object in his hands, a glossy A4 photograph turned upside down. Melvin Griffin was sitting on the edge of the bed, hunched over, looking like a broken shadow of the man he once was. His gaze was once again directed into the void, to the spot on the wall where he had been hiding his memories for the past 10 days. Harrison silently walked over to the bedside table and placed the photograph face up. The picture, taken in the forensic morgue, showed Pearl Griffin's skull. Cleaned of silt and tissue debris, the bone revealed the horrific truth: a deep, spider-like fracture in the back of the head. It was not just proof of death. It was a portrait of the last second of her life. "She didn't fall, Melvin," the detective said quietly. "And she didn't drown. She was killed. The blow was so hard that she didn't even realize she was dying. You can't keep quiet any longer. Look at her." Melvin's reaction was instant and devastating. He looked at the photo, and his catatonic stupor fell to pieces. The man covered his face with his palms, weaving his fingers through his overgrown, tangled hair, and began rocking back and forth. A sound that could hardly be called a cry escaped from his chest. It was a dry, hoarse wail, full of pain that was impossible to bear. He slid off the bed and onto the floor, curled up in a fetal position, and spoke for the first time in 2 years. His voice broke into a whisper. His words were slurred. But Detective Harrison caught every phrase, piecing together a picture of that fateful night. According to Melvin's testimony, on July 15, 2015, at about 2 in the morning, the Griffin camp turned into hell. The air was freezing, and the temperature dropped to near freezing. Louise had not slept for 2 days. The abrupt withdrawal of neuroleptics provoked a severe withdrawal syndrome, multiplied by acute psychosis. She walked around the dying campfire, talking to herself. Her movements were jerky and her speech incoherent. She accused the forest of watching her and her parents of conspiring with demons. Pearl woke up to the noise. When she saw her daughter's condition, she did what her maternal instinct told her to do. She tried to help. She came out of the tent with a fleece jacket over her shoulders and slowly approached Louise, stretching out her arms as if to hug the frightened child. "Hush, honey, we're here. We love you," she whispered, according to Melvin. But for Louise in that state, it was not a gesture of love, but an attack. Melvin, who was just getting out of his sleeping bag, saw everything in slow motion. Louise bent down and grabbed the heavy, sharp piece of granite they had been using instead of a hammer to drive the tent pegs into the rocky ground. There was no recognition in her eyes. "She didn't hesitate," Melvin whispered to the investigator, looking at the floor. "It was one movement, sharp, strong. She swung and hit Pearl right in the back of the head. There was a sound, a dull crunch. Pearl just went down. She didn't even scream. She fell face first into the ground and never moved again." Melvin ran to his wife and turned her over. Her eyes were open, but there was no life in them. There was no pulse. Death came instantly. Louise stood over them, breathing heavily, with a stone in her hand. She did not cry, did not try to help. She looked at her mother's body with cold curiosity, and then turned her gaze to her father. "It's your fault," she said then. "You made me do it." At that moment, Melvin Griffin was faced with a choice that destroyed his soul. The normal reaction is to call for help, to tie up the killer, even if it's your child. But Melvin was broken by years of manipulation and emotional terror. When he told Louise that she had to go to the police, she was hysterical. But it wasn't a hysterical tantrum of remorse. She put a bloody stone to her temple and started screaming. "If you turn me in, I'll kill myself," she screamed. "I'll smash my head right here. You'll lose us both. Do you want to be all alone? They'll put me in a cage, Dad. Do you want your little girl to die in prison?" Melvin admitted that in that moment, his mind was clouded by a panicked, irrational desire to save at least what was left of his family. He could not bear the thought of losing both his wife and daughter in one night. He convinced himself that Louisa was sick, that she did not understand what she was doing, that she could be cured if he just gave her time and rest. It was a fatal mistake born of despair. Instead of calling the Rangers, he made a decision that turned him from a victim to an accomplice. He decided to cover up the crime. Melvin hid Pearl's body in a backpack to carry it away from camp and dump it in a mountain stream, hoping the water would hide the traces forever. And then he took Louise by the hand and led her off the trail, into the wilds of the reserve where no one would find them. He thought he was saving his daughter from prison. He thought he could control the situation. But as he led Louise into the darkness of the forest, Melvin didn't realize that he wasn't really saving her. He was locking himself in a cage with a monster for whom the murder of his mother was only the beginning of a bloody journey. On September 3rd, 2017, Melvin Griffin's interrogation in a ward at Mono General Hospital was already in its 4th hour. Detective Mark Harrison, who had seen dozens of criminals in his career, admitted later that he had never heard anything like it. Melvin's confession was not a story of escape from justice. It was a chronicle of a slow, methodical descent into hell, where the jailer was not the system, but his own child, and the majestic rocks of Yosemite served as the bars. According to Melvin, after that fateful night in July of 2015, they didn't just get off the trail, they disappeared. Guided by a map he knew by heart, Melvin took his daughter to the wildest part of the park, Matterhorn Canyon. It is a place where granite peaks cut the sky like knife blades, and where human feet set foot once every few years. The first weeks were a struggle for physical survival. They ate berries, roots, and the remnants of provisions taken from Pearl's backpack. But the real horror began when physical hunger became commonplace and psychological terror became constant. The next 700 days turned the former architect into a shadow. Melvin told the investigators that the dynamics of their relationship changed completely in the second month of his life in the forest. The chemical barrier created by the neuroleptics disappeared completely. It was replaced by cold, crystal-clear cruelty. Louise was no longer a patient. She became an observer. "She didn't scream," Melvin whispered, looking at his mangled hands. "She spoke softly, very quietly. She would sit by the fire while I cleaned the squirrel I had caught and just look at me. And then she would say, 'Do you know why Mom is dead, Dad? Because you made me angry. You made me do it. If you make me angry again, I'll do it to you, or to myself.'" It was a perfect psychological trap. Louise manipulated the only thing Melvin had left, his fear of losing his last loved one. She threatened to kill herself every time he tried to object to her or suggest going out to people. She would take a sharp stone and slowly run it over her wrist, looking her father in the eye until he fell to his knees and begged her to stop. Melvin turned into a servant. He built shelters of branches and moss to protect her from the wind and snow. He stood for hours in the icy water of mountain streams, trying to catch trout with his bare hands, because Louise was demanding food. He gave her the best pieces, the warmest clothes he had taken off, and slept at the entrance to the cave, serving as a human shield against bears and cougars. "She was getting stronger," he told the detective, his voice filled with superstitious horror. "The forest didn't scare her. It seemed to accept her. She learned to move as silently as a shadow. She could sit still for hours, watching the deer. I saw her smile when she found a dead bird. She would play with it. She would take it apart." Louise created her own world where she was a deity and her father was her slave. She forbade him to call her by name, forcing him to address her simply as she, or to be silent. Any attempt at disobedience was punished. One day, when Melvin tried to leave a mark on a tree, hoping they would be found, Louise noticed it. At night, she burned his only warm socks, forcing him to wrap his feet with pieces of raw deerskin. 2 winters passed like that. 2 years of isolation, hunger, and constant expectation of death. But the worst thing happened in August of 2017. Melvin noticed a change in his daughter's behavior. She became restless. More and more often, she came to the edge of the plateau, where she could see the distant lights of the towns in the valley. A new gleam appeared in her eyes, the gleam of a predator that had become cramped in its domain. She began to practice with the knife Melvin had carved from a piece of slate to develop the ink. On August 23, 2017, the day before Melvin showed up at the gas station, the denouement occurred. That night, they spent the night in a cleft in the rock near the pass. Melvin woke up to a strange, cold sensation around his neck. When he opened his eyes, he saw Louise. She was sitting over him, holding his homemade knife in her hand. The moonlight fell on her face, turning it into a mask. "I don't need you anymore, Daddy," she whispered. Her voice was completely calm, casual, as if she were talking about the weather. "You've gotten old and slow. You're pulling me back. I've learned everything I need to know." Melvin tried to get up, but she pressed the blade to his throat. "Don't move," she said. "I'm not going to kill you now. It would be too easy. I want you to live and know that it was you who let me out. I'll find my own way out. I'll go there, to them, and when I get out, I'll tell them all that you killed Mom, that you kept me here by force and abused me. They will believe me. Everyone always believes the poor little girl." She took the knife, their last supply of jerky and a flask of water. Then she stood up and, without looking back, disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Melvin lay on the cold stones until dawn, paralyzed with terror. But when the first rays of the sun touched the peaks, he came to a realization that was worse than his own death. He realized that he had created something terrible. All these 2 years, he thought he was protecting his daughter from the world. But in reality, he was protecting the world from her. Now the barriers have come down. Louise, armed, trained to survive and kill, full of hatred and the ability to manipulate, went to people. She went where there were tourists, where there were families with children, where no one expected danger from an exhausted teenage girl. Melvin Griffin got to his feet. His body ached. His feet were scraped to blood. But fear gave him strength. He did not leave to save himself. He knew that his life was over the night Pearl died. He was going to warn her. He had to get ahead of her. He had to tell people that it was not a victim coming down from the mountains, but a hunter. And when he finished his story in the hospital room, Detective Harrison realized why Melvin had reacted so panicked to his daughter's name. He wasn't afraid for her. He was afraid of what she would do next. The detective turned off the recorder and went to the window. Somewhere behind the glass, the sun was setting behind the Sierra Nevada mountains, plunging the forests into darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, armed with a knife and a perfect plan of revenge, Louise Griffin was approaching civilization. Time has passed. On September 4, 2017, at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, an emergency meeting was held in the conference room of the Mono County Sheriff's Office that radically changed the course of the operation. The large whiteboard where the photos of the missing teenager had previously hung was now marked with a new orientation. Louise Griffin's status was officially changed. She was no longer being sought as a victim in need of rescue, but as an armed and particularly dangerous criminal suspected of first-degree murder. The county sheriff, addressing a consolidated team of local detectives, Yosemite Park rangers, and federal agents who had joined the case, emphasized the unprecedented nature of the situation. They were not looking for a scared child. They were hunting an 18-year-old woman who had spent 780 days in complete isolation in the wilderness. Her psyche was deformed, her instincts were sharpened to the limit, and her survival skills surpassed those of most searchers. She knew the terrain, was not afraid of blood, and, according to her father's testimony, was armed with a homemade knife that she had already once held to a person's throat. On the same day, at 14 hours and 30 minutes, the first confirmation came that Louise had left the highlands and started to descend into the valley. A ranger patrol, checking out remote tourist shelters in the Glen Olin camp area, found signs of entry into one of the huts that had been mothballed for the winter. It was not a rough break-in. The window pane had been carefully cut out, probably with a sharp stone or the same knife Melvin had mentioned. Inside the cabin, there was relative order, indicating the cold calculation of the intruder. Only specific items were missing: 3 cans of high-calorie stew, a package of dry alcohol, a warm fleece jacket with the park's logo, and, what worried investigators the most, a detailed topographic map of the area at a scale of 1 to 24,000 were missing. Money left on the table by one of the tourists and expensive photographic equipment remained untouched. This showed that Louisa was not just wandering around at random. She was planning a route. She was preparing for a long walk and probably knew where she was going. On September 6, 2017, at 17 hours and 15 minutes, a call was received that turned the search into an active phase of pursuit. A group of 4 hikers from Seattle were hiking down a scenic trail near Waterville Falls. This is a popular place where the Tuolumne River roars down the granite slopes, forming water wheels. The noise of the water is so loud that it drowns out footsteps, which allowed the fugitive to get close to people without being noticed. One of the tourists, 30-year-old architect David Morris, lagged behind the group to take a panoramic photo of the waterfall. According to his words, recorded in the police report, he felt the gaze on him a moment before he saw it. A girl stepped out from behind the manzanita bushes. Her appearance was terrifying. Tangled hair that resembled felt, a face covered with a layer of dirt and soot, and clothes consisting of rags and a stolen fleece jacket that was too big for her. But it was her eyes that struck David the most. There was no plea for help in them. It was the appraising look of a predator deciding whether to attack its prey. "She didn't say hello," Morris told investigators, his hands still shaking as he held his coffee cup. "She just held out her hand and said one word. Food." Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. "I was confused. I thought she was lost and started reaching into my backpack to get my phone and call the Rangers. I told her, 'Wait, I'll help you. The Rangers will be here soon.' This word became a trigger. As soon as I said the word Rangers, the stranger's expression changed. She bared her teeth, making a sound like a wild cat hissing. A heavy river rock was instantly in her hand. David didn't even have time to raise his arms to defend himself. The blow was aimed at his head, right at the temple. But he managed to recoil, and the stone slid over his shoulder, causing a severe bruise. "She was trying to kill me," Morris said. "I could see it in her eyes. She didn't want to scare me. She wanted to break my skull." His friends came running to hear David scream. Seeing a group of people, the attacker did not engage in combat. She instantly assessed the balance of power and, throwing a stone into the water, jumped from a 3-meter ledge into the dense ferns. Her movements were so fast and agile that the tourists did not even have time to realize where she had disappeared to. When a special unit arrived 40 minutes later, the dogs picked up the trail. But it did not lead deep into the forest, as expected. The trail led along the riverbed, downstream, in the direction where the wilderness area ended, and Tioga Road, the main transportation artery of the park, began. The analysis of the map stolen from Glen Olin and the location of the attack near the waterfalls allowed detectives to build a forecast of the fugitive's movement. She did not move chaotically. She was walking along old, forgotten gold miners' trails, which were marked with a dotted line on the map. Her goal was not just to escape. She was purposefully approaching one point on the map that was of strategic importance. She was heading for the old mines, where she could hide from helicopters, and where she could access a road full of potential victims and cars. On September 7th, late in the evening, a thermal imager aboard the search helicopter detected a faint heat signal in the area of the abandoned Great Sierra mine. It was the perfect place for an ambush. A maze of underground tunnels that cut through the mountain with dozens of exits and vents. Louise Griffin seemed to have found her fortress. She stopped, ceasing to move. and this meant only one thing. She was preparing for a meeting. The police began to gather forces at the foot of the mountain, realizing that the morning of September 8th would be decisive. The trap was about to close, but no one knew who would end up in it, the hunters or the prey itself, which had long ceased to be human. On September 8, 2017, at 5:45 in the morning, the silence around the Great Sierra Mine historical site was broken by the sound of heavy boots and short, fragmented commands over the radio. This old silver mine, located at an altitude of more than 3,000 meters off the Tioga Road, had long been a haven for bats and wind. But that morning, it became the stage for the final act of the Griffin family tragedy. A joint tactical team of SWAT team members and federal agents secured the perimeter. Thermal imagers confirmed that there was a heat source deep in the main adit, 50 meters from the entrance. The capture operation began when the first rays of the sun just touched the snow-capped peaks of the Dana Range. The assault team moved slowly, checking every dark corner of the tunnel, reinforced by old, half-rotted beams. The air inside was musty, full of the smell of dampness and recent human occupancy. On the walls were traces of soot from torches. When the beam of a tactical flashlight caught sight of a figure in the depths of the tunnel, the officers froze. Louise Griffin stood in a dead end, her back pressed against the cold rock. She looked like a creature from another world. She was wearing a deerskin jacket stitched with animal veins over a stolen fleece sweatshirt. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her face was painted with a mixture of soot and clay. In her right hand, she clutched a homemade knife, its blade gleaming faintly in the streetlights. But it was not her appearance that was most frightening, but her behavior. She did not attack silently, like an animal. She spoke, and her voice was clear, loud, and full of theatrical desperation. "Don't shoot!" she screamed, raising her free hand but not releasing the knife. "He made me hide! My father! He killed my mom! He tried to kill me! I was defending myself!" The officers were confused for a moment. An 18-year-old girl was standing in front of them, begging for help, accusing her father of the most serious sins. Her words sounded logical, convincing, with the right tone of victimization. She was manipulating the situation even here, on the edge of the abyss. "Drop the knife, Louise," the group leader commanded. Just drop the knife. "He raped me!" she continued to scream, taking a step toward the armed men. "You don't understand! He's a monster!" However, when one of the officers lowered his weapon to retrieve the handcuffs, the victim's mask flew off instantly. Louisa lunged, trying to stab the nearest Special Forces officer in the neck. The group's reaction was instantaneous. Instead of firearms, a long-range stun gun was used. 2 electrodes stuck into her homemade jacket, and a discharge of 50,000 volts cut off her scream. The girl's body convulsed and fell to the stone floor of the mine. The arrest took place at 6:20 in the morning. The trial of Louise Griffin began on March 14, 2018, and became one of the most high-profile events in the state of California. In the courtroom, the defendant looked completely different. Her lawyers had worked hard on her image. Clean hair, a modest blouse, and thin-rimmed glasses. She sat quietly, her eyes down, occasionally wiping her non-existent tears with a handkerchief. The line of defense was based on the complete discrediting of Melvin. Louise claimed that her father had killed her stepmother in a fit of anger and then kidnapped her, keeping her in the woods as a sex slave for 2 years. As the jury listened to her testimony, Many of them began to have doubts. Melvin Griffin, who took the stand, looked confused and broken, while Louise's speech was clear and emotionally calibrated. She seemed about to win the game. The turning point came on the 5th day of the hearing. The prosecutor called a technical expert and asked him to play a video found in a cave near Mount Conness. When the cold voice of 16-year-old Louisa sounded in the courtroom, "I know that these pills are to turn me into a vegetable." And when everyone saw her knocking the food out of her mother's hands, the atmosphere changed instantly. This video tore off the mask of the innocent victim, showing the true face of a domestic tyrant whom her own parents feared. The final nail in the defense's coffin came from the forensic experts. A forensic physician demonstrated a 3D model of Pearl Griffin's skull. The trajectory of the blow went from the bottom up at a specific angle. Given Melvin's height of 6 feet and 2 inches, he could not physically deliver such a blow while standing next to her. Instead, Louise's height and position, assuming the victim was leaning toward her as Melvin described, were perfectly consistent with the nature of the injury. The examination proved that the fatal blow was delivered by a person no taller than 5 feet 5 inches. On May 28, 2018, the judge announced the verdict. Melvin Griffin pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and unlawful burial of a body as part of a plea deal with the investigation. He was sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Louise Griffin was found guilty of second-degree murder and assault on a tourist. A psychiatric examination conducted by leading state experts diagnosed her with dissociative personality disorder, psychopathy, with a high level of aggression and lack of remorse. The court ruled that she posed an exceptional danger to society. Instead of a regular prison, she was sent to the closed state hospital, Patton State Hospital, for an indefinite period of involuntary treatment. This actually meant life imprisonment, as doctors predicted that she would not be able to be rehabilitated. Melvin Griffin was released in January 2022, having served his full sentence. He did not return to architecture, nor did he restore his old connections. He lives in a small apartment in the suburbs of Sacramento, working as a night watchman in a warehouse. Once a month, regardless of the weather, he gets into his old car and drives 120 miles to Yosemite National Park. He always stops at the same place, at the Olmsted Point observation deck. It offers a majestic view of Tenaya Canyon and the northern slope of Half Dome. The wind is always strong there, whistling in his ears, drowning out his thoughts. Melvin stands by the stone fence for hours, looking out over the endless sea of granite and forest. He looks at the place where his beloved Pearl is forever gone. And he looks at the place where he lost his daughter. Not the day she was taken away by the police, and not the day she hit her mother with a stone. He realizes that he lost her much earlier, even before they first set foot on this fateful trail. Mountains keep their secrets forever. But for Melvin, this silence is the only thing left of his family. And as the sun sinks below the horizon, painting the rocks blood red, he whispers words of apology that no one but the wind will ever hear.